guess it's been, 30 years ago or more when A Nation at Risk came out, that imperative for education reform. I think it really challenged business leaders and other education stakeholders to really think about how economic development and education tie in together and what we're going to have to do to make sure that we have an informed citizenry. And I think it really brought about the urgency as well. And at that time, especially in the Southeast, we saw this proliferation, seemed like, of education organizations that really focused on education reform. Organizations like the Pritchard Committee began, the A+ Education Partnership in Alabama, the North Carolina Public School Forum, and others. So it seemed like the South in particular, and probably because of poverty issues, was really focused on this whole idea of what have we got to do to improve education. Not just K-12, we had to focus on the entire pipeline. So about 10 years after that, it took us a while to go through the discussions, but about 10 years after that, there was a discussion among business leaders here in the state about how are we going to prepare our citizens for an acceptable quality of life, how are we going to grow economically, how are companies going to be able to compete on a global level. So all that came together, all those discussions among a number of business leaders at the time, and we thought we needed to formalize this effort. So those business leaders actually went to Dr. Art Dunning, who was then with the Board of Regents, and said, could we borrow you for a couple of years? And because of Art's wealth of experience, Art came in, and along with business leaders like Ann Kramer, who was with IBM at the time, created this organization and this effort. Art, can you go back in time a little bit and talk to us a little bit about what was going on in the environment at the time? Why this effort to create an organization like the Georgia Partnership, and what was it all about?
Diana, I think there were two things that played during that time. You mentioned the Nation at Risk. There was a lot of discussion about how you leverage your intellectual assets, economic assets, and how do you collaborate. And that was not something people were doing very much. I had spent some time in the system office traveling around the state, and when I would get into a community where we had 2 university system campuses, there was almost always a zero-sum discussion where I have to win, you have to have a corresponding loss. So this whole idea of collaboration was not present at all within the system, but also across the state. And I think the business leaders who came to see me, I think they became aware of some of the things we were trying to do in the system is to begin to leverage relationships. How do you work together? And I think when we first started to talk about that, at least when I went to some places around the state, you were treated somewhat like a heretic in terms of switching kind of the narrative to move from this whole idea of intense competition to look at how you can build bridges from K-12 to your colleges to the university. And the business leaders at the time talked about, we are not educators, we don't know the processes, we don't know the bureaucracy, we don't know the culture, but we like to participate, we like to get involved and help us to determine role, scope, and place. And I found that fascinating, I found it intriguing, where people were trying to say, where do we have assets that don't get in the way of people who have this responsibility day in and day out? And they came up with this whole idea of a partnership where you would have an equal voice around the table from government, from business, and education, and put together a group of people who were, like Ann and others, who were to drive the process, to work on it day in and day out. And they asked me to take a leave of absence from the system, and the Board of Regents agreed to do that. And we spent some time working with the Woodruff Foundation, getting funding. But what we did, and I'll make one more comment and stop, is that we looked at the categories of oversight that we needed, whether it was financing, leadership, governance, all of those aspects of life and education that makes the difference. And there was one kind of cross-cutting theme that I thought was very important. Education leads to employment, employment leads to economic development. And we have, at the time, and it was causing a lot of angst with a lot of people when we were talking about Georgia as a very bipolar state, one that's growing and developing economic and another that's very poor. And many people came along and said later, no, there's a third Georgia, one extremely poor. And what is getting to get to the bottom of this in Georgia is a better educational process and better outcomes. And so this group, very enlightened people, I thought, from the chamber, asked me to take this leadership role on, and I agreed to do it. And over 20 years later, you're still here thriving.
Yeah, I think at the time, I was one of the first employees that Art hired. And if I remember correctly, he said, don't you hang your hat here very long because we won't be in business forever. Well, here we are 20 years later, 20 plus years. And you were president at the time and had certainly representing that strong business voice. Why is it so critically important in all these conversations about developing human capital, about education, about growing our economy?
Well, I think it's so critical for all of us to realize how important that Nation at Risk report was, that it did wake us up to a critical issue that the changing skills required for the workforce were going from those manufacturing type skills to the knowledge worker. And for years, and I mean, Kevin and I laughed, there were the silos. The business people we created the jobs and expected the educators to create the people, and then the nonprofit or the NGO sector would create support services, and that we kind of worked within our silos expecting that kind of transition of the human capital or the workers to be available. And all of a sudden, with the Nation at Risk, we were sort of called to task with this abrupt realization that there were some broken parts of the system and that we as business couldn't just stay in our silo and expect us to be able, if we didn't communicate what our needs were, there was no way for that bridge to be built where the workers would transition into this kind of workforce of tomorrow. At the same time, and many of you will recall, there was an education summit at the national level with the president, all the governors, and the business community saying, then how do we collectively come together to address this issue related to education reform? And that was primarily in the K-12 arena to create that workforce-ready population to proceed into those jobs, especially into the post-secondary, community college, technical schools, and of course higher ed. And then we in Georgia took that lead. The Georgia Chamber was able to sort of look up their periscope, realizing the governor had participated in the summit, and that we said we wanted to be a part of this, and consequently coming together for the first time. This was very unique, to come together at the same table, because we always had a business table, we always had a political table, we always had an education table, and we always had a nonprofit table. But this was the first time that we brought together the business leaders, the education leaders from pre-K through 2, because we also, oh yeah, it starts early. This was when we did the action report for then, before Governor Barnes, to do a lot of work there. And then we said the political leaders, the state house, the representatives and the senators, to bring them to the table, Page to the table, GAE to the table, and of course the educators. Not only those involved at the state level, but those who were involved at the local level. So a lot of people said this is absurd, obscene, won't work, because as Art was mentioning, there was never the sense of collaboration. I'm in my lane, I do my stuff, just leave me alone. And so it was kind of fabulous though, because at the table we not only built trust, we had gone around the state at the time and come up with 85 recommendations that were critically acclaimed as vital for our state to not only prepare for the workforce, but it's really enhancing the quality of life. The other day I heard a kind of a funny story where they said, oh, those people in education, they just want to prepare business leaders with workers. And you say, well, yeah, we do want to provide workers and citizens and people involved in community. So at the table, we worked hard and often longer, because for a business perspective, we realized if we were going to succeed in a globally competitive environment, remember this was at the time when we were in a globally competitive environment, So we had to grow our talent pipeline, human capital, at the local level to be ready for the work. So it was really important to understand that all the sectors for the first time were coming together, facing issues that were critically important to each one, not just for thriving, but for really being investors in the future. And yet we still, and when we get back to it, we're going to see we still have the same issues of poverty. We have the same issues of folks not ready. We have the same issues of babies not reading and children not at grade level. And so it's enhancing what I think is the role back to you all relative to adult learners of how we really do focus on preparing people to be citizens and prepared for the work.
Ann and I were chatting, well, we all were chatting a couple of weeks ago when we were preparing for this session, and Ann and I both laughed about what is old is new again. And all those messages 20 years ago are still relevant messages. We still have not totally cracked that nut, but we have certainly been working on it. And I think thinking about your mentioning the tables, all of us at various tables, government over here, education here, business leaders here, and then community leaders out there somewhere. I think at the same time, when you think about the education community and what we're doing to develop that pipeline, sometimes we see those separate tables with early learning, K-12 education, technical colleges, and higher education colleges and universities over here too. So I was so excited to hear the message that Mary Ellen gave about technical colleges and the governor coming together again in order to, I guess, relaunch Complete College Georgia to get that focus back on it again. Going back to Kevin and Ann, I know both of you have been heavily involved with your respective chambers. Kevin is on the leadership team for the Georgia Chamber of Commerce and works closely with his local chamber, the DeKalb County Chamber. Ann is involved heavily for years with the Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce and also with the Atlanta Regional Commission. And I think as I hear, I pick up all the different conversations that are going on, and I hear the wording around competitiveness agendas, and all of them are working on these competitiveness agendas and collective impact, which now seems to be the buzzwords for the day. But tell us, Kevin, if you don't mind starting, tell us a little bit about what is this thing about competitiveness agendas and how does it relate to that human capital development? And Ann, if you'll comment as well.
Yep. Yeah, sure, Diane. The governor a few years ago engaged the Georgia Chamber to pursue a competitiveness initiative that he had laid out to make Georgia the most competitive state in the union in which to do business. And of course that meant, having an education system that performed well, transportation, healthcare, and it was, as you know, we faced challenges in each of those areas statewide and in regional parts of our state. So it was a big effort, a big initiative, and I think it has paid dividends with some of the accolades that Georgia has gotten, but we still have a lot of work to do in these areas. And this year, the Georgia Chamber decided that one of our key focus areas was going to be to enhance individual competitiveness, because the individual side of that got a little bit lost potentially. When we talked about the Competitiveness Initiative, it was about a low regulatory environment, about making sure people could get from here to there as far as transportation goes, having a strong port facility and trade and commerce and all of those things. But we needed to have that come full circle by really looking at the individual and saying, do we have individuals in the state of Georgia who are competitive, who can earn a living, who can support their families, who can really advance and explore all of the talents that they have. And that's a fairly big effort for the Georgia Chamber, but it's one that we're really excited about because we think that we're central to that discussion and being able to enhance that individual competitiveness. And that individual competitiveness, of course, is whether you're from rural Georgia or Atlanta, whether you're low income, middle income, or higher income. It's really across the board and making sure that we don't leave anybody behind in terms of enhancing our overall individual competitiveness. So that's been a big focus of ours this year, Diane, and I think that adult learning is a big piece of that, because at the end of the day, you can't just, write off a huge segment of the population who perhaps only has a high school degree at this point and doesn't have those skills that are needed to really be individually competitive in today's economy. So I think that the adult learning focus of this conference is absolutely central to that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's so interesting. The U.S. Chamber, of which I was a part and still work with quite a bit, had established 3 major objectives. One is, of course, to require that there's a quality, rigorous process and transformation of the pre-K through 12th. And that, of course, includes the high school completion and readiness for post-secondary. The second is sort of in your bailiwick, is to increase that post-secondary successful completion rate. We in Georgia still have a ways to go. And the third, which is sort of where you play across those other 2, is to train workers for jobs that are current and future. And it is to create that place of the skills gap. So it's been very interesting to see then how different communities have taken that challenge within those 3 sort of purviews. We've seen what our governor has done relative to with the Georgia Chamber. And he's also challenged, and we've seen it in local communities. I happen to live in Atlanta, and our Metro Chamber has taken this very seriously. And I have to laugh because we have been here a few years, if not decades, Mary Ellen. And it used to be, Diane and I would laugh, is to talk to, especially the chambers about education, and as Kevin says, that's not in my vocabulary. I'm in to create the regulatory system, create a climate for business in Georgia, that's tax. All these things in education, not my business. Well, now, after we talk about infrastructure, yes, roads, yes, building, yes, bridges, yes, gas, yes, utilities. Oh, yes, the most important infrastructure of a community is the human resource, human capital. And so now the business community, of course, is waking up to it in that collaborative with everyone else. So the Metro Chamber has taken this as their #1 issue. And it's then also working within our regional planning associations. And for us in the Atlanta Regional Commission, back to competitiveness, had created an economic competitiveness initiative, of which there are 4 pillars. Of course, prosperous job creation. Of course, livable, that's transportation, air, water, quality of life. Of course, innovative, because we like creative work. But of course, educated, which is the base transition, the whole foundation for a community. So it's been interesting to me to see that evolution and then how across the state of Georgia that has really seeped. And of course, the partnership has led that kind of essence where in communities like Troup County or Paulding or different counties, they've all said, we want to come together collectively, business community, government, local government, the nonprofit community, the education community, to say, oh wow, how can we improve our community to be competitive? Not just to address the skills gap, but to create a community to which people want to come and stay and work, ready to work.
And I expect they're having those same conversations
In
even in
Albany.
Albany,
You
Georgia,
bet.
right, Art?
They are.
In all likelihood. We certainly talk about, we've reflected a lot about 20 years ago when the Georgia Partnership was created and the conversations about why it was so important to link the education pipeline with economic development. But since those 20 years, I think we also talk a lot about how skills have changed, about what our expectations are for what people should know in order to be successful. Kevin, you're the president and CEO of a successful company, and I expect you see it more than the rest of us do. Can you tell us a little bit about what you think makes a successful employee and what it really takes now, especially in relation to education?
Sure, yeah, and our workforce is kind of an interesting one. We have about half the folks in our company are highly educated, a lot of degrees, a lot of advanced degrees, masters, doing supply and trading and marketing and our sales and our IT and all of those sorts of things, So that's about half of our population. Then we have another half, which are our customer service operation, our customer care operation, which are predominantly folks that historically have had high school education and have perhaps done some higher education as well. So it's kind of an interesting workforce. We get to see, both halves of that, if you will, and it's pretty proportioned. It's about 50-50 really, as far as, looking at the backgrounds educationally of our company. We have about 170 employees in total. I will say on the customer care side, we're happy that we do our own customer service. Customer service oftentimes gets outsourced today, and it becomes a little bit of a, dead-end career, if you will, for folks who say, well, I'm never going to get off the phones, I'm never going to get to do anything else. And in our case, we're actually doing that service ourselves, and so we do have a lot of our employees on the customer care side who have aspirations for doing other things over the course of their career. We certainly have folks that also are very happy doing customer service, and that's what they're really good at and what they want to focus on. But we have a very big population who are saying, hey, I want to get to the next level, I want to move up. And one of the things that we expect is that for a lot of those other jobs, you have to have a college education. And it's interesting, we get some blowback on that, and a lot of our employees, and they may be, single moms, and they came from a more difficult socioeconomic background, and are saying, hey, that's not fair. I want to be able to compete for these other types of positions in marketing and operations and outside of the customer care universe, and I'm kind of shut out because I don't have a degree. And I think that's something that we take into account when we hear, but I think there are a couple of things that we believe you get from having a college education. The first one is critical thinking skills and communication skills. So it doesn't matter so much, what specifically did you study? Did you study business versus something else? At the end of the day, there's a certain critical thinking that we see out of our college grads that most of the time, not always, but most of the time we don't really see with the folks that have high school degrees, because they really haven't developed those skills. And then the second thing is that when somebody sets a goal for themselves and says, hey, I'm going to go and I'm going to get my degree, and they succeed in that, I think it's a very good indicator that they're going to be successful in the future opportunities that Gas South provides to those employees. So it's almost like a screen which says, you set a goal for yourself, you were able to achieve it, you came out with a certain set of skills. And I think so it's both important on the skill side as well as that goal orientation that somebody set up for themselves, that ambition that we look for. So that's how we kind of justify, so to speak, if you will, that decision about who should be able to apply for which jobs. Now I will say also on the customer service side, more and more it's important for folks to actually have some college or even a college education, because even customer care is not what it used to be. You mentioned, Dan, manufacturing. Manufacturing used to be, you kind of
widget.
Put together a widget, and that's what you did, and you were on the assembly line and everything else. And today you've got to know how to operate sophisticated machinery. You've got to be able to do math, sometimes quite advanced math and calculations. And in our business, similarly, a customer care employee is not just taking orders anymore. They're problem solving. They're working with complex IT systems that are integrated. In our case, there's a lot of math that the customer service representative must be able to do when the customer calls and asks about their bill and the various charges. And if you can't add up everything for the customer and then convey that information effectively, you're going to be lost. So we've put higher and higher standards on what we expect. Now, still the majority of the folks that we have in our customer care operation are high school grads and don't have degrees. But this year, for the first time, we developed a pipeline development program, we're calling it, no pun intended, even though we're a gas company, but it's really about a leadership pipeline. And we're hiring college grads to join the company, and the equivalent of our shop floor is our customer care operation. We don't have a shop floor per se, but customer care is where it all begins, right? That's the voice and the ears of the company. And so we are training college grads to come in, get fully familiar with our systems, which will benefit them no matter where within the organization they go, and spend 6 months on the phones providing customer care, and then rotate through various other areas of the company. So we're trying to create more of a culture around continuous improvement, a more educated workforce, if you will, that have some of those meta skills that are important for providing the highest quality customer service, and so that somebody doesn't sound like, a robot when they're on the phone. So we're moving in that direction, and it is a big change for us, and I think other companies are seeing
Yeah.
that too, Diane.
So thinking about that continuous improvement, and you're addressing different levels, different types of employees too. I sort of bring it back to the state and what the state is doing now, because as we're talking about human capital, we've got to have a multiple efforts
Approach.
going on in order to make sure all of our employees, all of our adults are prepared to compete. So what else is going on at the state?
Very
end?
exciting. And I'm going to give 5, quick. I'm so excited. As Kevin indicated, we now estimate that over 90% of the jobs that are offered in the pipeline now require some level of post-secondary. So the issue is how critical you are, because that means returning to work, already in the workplace, as well as in the moving pipeline of young people require post-secondary to do their work. So 5 quick ways that we in Georgia are already in this pipe, and you're in it too. I am privileged to serve on the Governor's Office of Workforce Development, and I happen to chair the youth side. And we've been working with juvenile justice, for instance, because as we know, our governor is trying to reduce the recidivism rate, which is heavenly fabulous, both for prison population and juvenile. And in that is that meta skills, those soft skills of communications, collaboration, understanding a global cultural environment. The and is then to be able to match those when they come out of prison and or in juvenile with a community partner to provide, as Kevin is indicating, some kind of either continuing with post-secondary and or depending on where they are in their age and or academic achievement, as well as with a company that can begin to work with their internship, because internships are a critical success factor for folks to continue in the workplace. So the Governor's Office of Workforce Development is not only working with youth, but returning veterans. We have an amazing troops program, the Troops to Work, Troops to Trucks, all these Troops to Teachers, and focusing on with our local workforce investment boards how we can encourage and improve and increase the skills of our returning veterans and their families, frankly, to be ready for work. The second part, out of the Governor's Office of Workforce Development, hopefully most of you have seen this, and it's especially important to the TCSG institutions, is our Go Build. Literally my husband is waiting at home today to have our stove fixed. That still requires face-to-face. So electricians, welders, plumbers, all those kinds of things that require real hands, real people, but as Kevin has indicated, it's a much more sophisticated technology, and today you have to read, you have to do math, you have to be able to work it out, solve problems. So Go Build Georgia is amazing, and is really matching people to need. How many plumbers, who do we work, and how do we provide the internships? The third thing is really related to you is college access and complete college. We're working a lot with the state Pathways to Prosperity and Pathways to Progress to make sure that young people, even in middle school, begin to understand what is required to get a job. What should I be taking? What job? What courses? There's a new wonderful program, Work Ready Grad, where young people can begin to assess, if I want to be a doctor, what courses do I need to take from middle school, high school, and college? And so therefore to get the children not only out of high school, but understand what it means to get into college, ready for college, and therefore complete college. And in that access of how do I get financial aid, so that we're working with this college access program and REACH and the work in the student financial department, as well as Complete College Georgia. I remember Errol Davis, when he was chancellor, used to joke with me and said, Ann, if I could turn back every penny of the remedial work we have to do to the K-12 system, I would in a heartbeat. But the and is we can't and we don't. So then how do we create that readiness? And we're watching, I know Art will tell a little bit about what we're doing in our higher eds, of shortening the distance. I talked to Tim Hines in Clayton the other day, and they're doing some wonderful work of shortening the distance on that readiness factor. And 2 more really fun ones are the work that we see with TCSG, especially, and you all mentioned this, with adult literacy programs like Literacy Action, bringing those programs to the campuses to provide that fast start relative to reading skills, and therefore being able to assimilate much more quickly into the college campus and do the readiness for whatever the job, whether it's a go build or your degree. And of course the last one, which is that piece of co-oping and internshipping, currently there's a new website called iNav, and it's called Intern Navigation, working with all the university system colleges in the northern part of the metro area, where you create co-op linkages with jobs in that area. So it works USG, all your colleges, and the chambers, and the Atlanta Regional Commission identifying co-op, so that the kids will get the readiness, stickiness factor to know what it takes to work in a, quote, real job. So that between, again, that collaboration of from the workforce, Complete College Georgia, to iNav, you can see the stream of us realizing that we aren't good unless we work better together.
Boy, talk about collective impact.
It's so
Certainly all
exciting.
those efforts are going to have some collective
There's
impact.
a lot of good going
Yeah.
on. Then we just have to leverage it, build it, grow it.
With Complete College Georgia,
art.
I know that we've talked about by the year 2020, 60% of our population is going to need some sort of post-secondary education or a post-secondary degree. Currently, only 42% of our adults have that sort of degree, which means that we've got to add about 250,000 new college graduates by 2020. And according to my friends in higher education, there's no way we can reach that level by just depending upon all those 18 and 19-year-olds to come straight out of high school into college or into a post-secondary institution. So we've got to look at adult learning. And I think when we do that, we also need to recognize that the majority of our traditional students are really non-traditional students. The whole definition of traditional student has changed with, I think, more people holding down a job at the same time, more people being older, just all the things that they have to balance. Art, I know you've been in the higher education arena for so long now, and especially really hands-on now down in Albany. So what does higher education need to do to help those adult learners to recognize where they are in their lives?
Diane, I think there are two things that we need to start with. One is internally our business processes and practices that address the higher education needs of adults. I was thinking as we were talking earlier, I was a veteran, also a non-traditional student. I came out of service at age 22. Having done my 4 years, I would have been drafted had I not gone in, and spent 2 years in East Asia off the coast of China. And I came back and finished my last 2 years at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery and decided that I wanted to go to college. And so I went to the place where my mother and father had gone to college in the early 30s and walked into the registration office, admissions office. And I didn't realize what was happening at the time, but they were not prepared for a student who was not 18 to 22, just out of high school. And they had no idea what to do with me. And in fact, not only did they not have business processes and practices, culturally they were unkind. And so I went back on base and spoke with the base education officer, and he sent me to the University of Alabama Center in Montgomery. And they had a lot of airmen on that base, and so they were used to addressing the needs of the adult learner. As I reflect about that, it was clear to me, looking back all of those years, that we are now in a place where we have a lot of returning veterans, and these folks will be with us for a long time, whether they're in VA hospitals, whether they're in higher education. So it says to me, our business processes, our practices, and the way we address the learning needs of that population, the adult student, is going to be dramatically different than the 18 to 22. So that's one issue, this is the business processes and practices. The other thing is identifying where people are and the needs that they have academically. Assessment, how do you assess what people know and need to know and be able to do to get the jobs that are there. I think that's a huge piece of it. So all of the things that we've done historically will have to be put under scrutiny. I came into the hotel this morning about 3 o'clock this morning, and I came from San Diego, and I was out there for a commencement at the University of California, San Diego Medical School, supporting a young student I had in my office at the University of Georgia. She's from Clarkston. Her parents are from West Africa, but she grew up here. And she was at UGA, and she transferred from Georgia Perimeter College. And I used to work with her on seeing what would transfer, what would not transfer, and how to make all that happen. So I got kind of a hands-on with a student. So this notion of a seamless process is important as well. How do we look at the stratification we have in higher education in the state of Georgia and make it easy for these young folks to move? This young woman had issues like many of our students. I worry at Albany State how many students are leaving with debt. I really don't like to see so many students leave with debt. This young woman worked at Publix in Athens, and she worked at Shoe Rack, and then came home on the weekend and worked at Publix here in Atlanta. But yesterday she walked across the stage with an MD at the University of California, San Diego. And she's leaving there to go to general surgery for a residency at the University of California, San Francisco. And she was working in my office in Athens. The most striking thing about her when she was at UGA, she had no money. She was just trying to make everything work. And so as I reflect on those two stories, I'm thinking about business processes, practices, funding, support, all of those things for the adult learner. One is this young woman is a traditional student. I was the non-traditional student coming out of the military. How do we in higher education make sure we take a hard look at this huge sort of systemic change that's happening in the United States of America, how we are demanding more learning. And when I was in school at the University of Alabama as an undergraduate in Tuscaloosa, I majored in anthropology. And people in my community used to say, how are you going to make a living doing that? And that was during a time where liberal arts, I just loved the whole idea of it, did not connect work to it at all. I'm finding out that was perhaps one of the most important experiences I had. So this whole idea of learning how to learn, being a continuous learner, and we had an aversion to using words at the time like human capital and pipeline and all those things that we talk about now, but they are nevertheless real. So for all of us in higher education, I think this whole idea of business practices, policies, customer service, how we address the needs of the adult learner, they are very different from the 18 to 22-year-old. And so I think that's the first step.
Well said.
Good, beautiful.
I think we've got just a few minutes for questions, if there are any questions from the audience for the panelists. Any out there?
What experience do you have with people who get their forgery degree but now find they have to go back to tech schools to get training in order to really be employed?
So on our side, we have not had a lot of those issues because I feel like we can train the staff that we hire with those 4-year degrees to get up to speed on what they need to do. Now, there are some that pursue their advanced degrees. For us, it's more often than not some kind of business degree, a master's in business administration, master's in management, that sort of thing. And we encourage that. We provide some tuition assistance for our employees to do that, as well as their undergrad degree. And that can definitely benefit them, but I don't find that we have folks that come out of undergrad unable to do the work that we expect of them. Now, there are plenty of folks that interview for positions with us who we don't deem ready, but usually we've done a pretty good job of screening those out so that we feel like when we have a graduate coming in, they're ready to roll, they're ready to go. And I think that I agree with Art. I think a liberal arts education is a really valuable thing. I had a liberal arts education. We've resisted, for example, going out and hiring people into this pipeline development program with a, let's call it, some kind of business certificate or a BBA or something like that. We've steered very much away from that, and that's been very important to me to say, no, we're gonna consider anybody. We're gonna consider the kid with the anthropology degree who wants this type of position, or it might not even be a kid, it might be somebody, an adult learner as well. But that doesn't matter as much. What we want to see is a record of success in academic achievement, some level of work experience, internships, that sort of thing, and somebody who can interview well and can present well and can get a couple of good references, and then we feel pretty good about it.
It's so interesting. There's this both perceived and real situation where we on the business side say we interviewed 5,000 people and couldn't find one ready for work. And ready for work isn't always based on the degrees, which is where Kevin is. So I think there's this huge mismatch where some folks will come out of college. I guess I talk to some every day who say, Ann, I want to be the CEO. And I said, well, have you done job one yet? And that often means entering in an organization at a level where they may not want to be in 10 years. So it's an interesting dilemma, and how you have tough conversations. I do this literally all the time, tough conversations with especially the 20s and 30s about saying, well, I have my degree and nobody will hire me. And I want to go back and say, so what have you done relative to preparation for that work? And it often comes back to those meta skills, is problem solving, knowing what it means to dress ready to play every day, come to work, do job one is job one, do job one right and well, and then you will get job two. So I think because on the business side, we hear it all the time. I have to interview hundreds of people to find the one who's not just qualified, but ready to work.
And this new pipeline development program of ours is also meant to be a little bit of a filter. So, I think there are college grads who would say, I'm going to start 6 months doing customer service. I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
I deserve better than that. And that's a good filter for us because it shows us, is this somebody who is willing to really learn our business and get their hands dirty and do something that is really important to our business, but is not glamorous from the perspective of their career, or, are they, and if that person says, yes, I'm up for that, I think they're going to be a great long-term employee. If they weren't interested in doing any of those things as a college grad, it's probably a pretty good indicator that they wouldn't work out that well. So we're optimistic about this program, really, kind of introducing a new sort of employee, a new sort of culture into our workforce, because we've recognized that our pipeline of talented folks who are ready for leadership, we've exhausted it somewhat from as we look at kind of our middle management positions. We're struggling a little bit in that area, so this is a way to kind of create that pipeline that we think will benefit us and the employees in the long run.
Good question.
Another question, maybe one more?
If they have not been in the military for at least, I believe, a year. And so the program has come to a halt at this point where they can no longer earn the credit we were giving them for, they're meds. And so my concern is there any other additional funding available in the state of Georgia so that these soldiers, whether they're at Columbus State or any other USG institution, they can continue to earn credit, whether it's online or they were earning credit online and in the classroom, maybe human anatomy type courses. But again, it had to stop because of those parameters were just instituted recently. And I just don't know what to do for these soldiers.
And you're saying the base terminated the funding? Did I hear you correctly?
Department of Defense, they have to be in the military at least a year, I believe, before they are qualified or eligible for the GoArmy.net financial assistance. And so they've had to stop unless they pay out of pocket.
Right. I am not aware of any funding at this point, but that's something I think we need really to address perhaps at the state level, and maybe have a conversation with the chancellor about it. Many of you have seen how many returning veterans are coming back to Georgia, and that's going to be an area that we'll be emphasizing. And I'd like to, maybe we can chat later, but Georgia is probably one of the largest states in the nation with returning veterans, also because of the number of facilities we have here, bases, and as well as Army posts. And I think that's going to be a population that will strengthen this complete college Georgia aspect of what we're doing. And the base education, I was thinking as you were talking, I was a base education officer in Thailand up near Laos and Cambodia as a DOD civilian for a number of years. And we used the University of Maryland to offer many of our courses in the Far East. And one of the things that we had to do periodically was to address the funding needs for the people who were there on a quick rotation. And online was not robust and vibrant at the time. So this is an area where I think we really do need to examine. And I'd like to follow up with you because I think that's going to be a ripe area for this state. But right now, I'm not aware of funding, but it's something I really want to look at.
Well, your local WIB, your Workforce Investment Board, does have veterans dollars for training. It's not all going into Go Build. And even some of the Go Build are the health IT jobs. So that may be an alternative to do some cash flow gap for you. But the local WIB, your Columbus, Muskogee County Workforce Investment Board may be an option because they do have funds.
Thanks so much. Well, we have come to the, one more question? All right.
I just kind of like to piggyback on what she said. She was talking about tuition assistance. And not only have they tried to reduce those funds for new people going into the military and making it way longer to use it, but they also are not allowing as many dollars, as many credit hours for those people that have been in the military. So for those people coming out in the Warriors Transition Battalions, that might be in that battalion for a year or more before they leave service. Frequently, they were full-time students and also having hospital appointments and things like that. They are not going to have that benefit any longer. They're limiting the number of credit hours that they can use.
Sort of thinking about our discussion of partnerships, yes, and that development of human capital, I think we have definitely got a to-do to add to our list. Now, I want to offer the panelists maybe just a second, half a minute, if that's okay, Mary Ellen, to make any final closing comment or any final thought relative to the conversation about partnerships and human capital development and economic development.
Diane, I think for me it was sort of a cultural shift, having been in higher education for so long, to engage in these kinds of discussions. I had this sort of intrinsic belief that knowledge for knowledge's sake, just it's important to learn. But this notion of application of knowledge was not something that I felt very comfortable about talking. That was your job to connect your bachelor's to the world of work. And that's where I think many of us were for a long time. And so when I was approached about doing this, I had to do a lot of reflection about, because I was in a college of liberal arts, this whole idea of the application of work. That may sound a little crazy at this point, but that's where a lot of people were in thinking about knowledge. So this sort of cultural and economic shift that I think we've made as a nation, and I think Nation at Risk did that for a lot of us. And so it was a sort of a searing experience for me, is to read all of this information and to connect the destiny of this country demographically, politically, socially, and otherwise to scholarship. And there was a kind of a stake in the ground about how important learning is for the well-being of citizens. And so here we are in 2014. I think we have really normalized this conversation, and there's not a whole lot of discomfort to think about what I call the notion of paying civic rent and civic duty and being good citizens in this country, and learning at the highest level and continuous learning. So we've made some really evolutionary sort of changes about the language we use to talk about this. I think the next step for all of us is to begin to look at this sort of change in this nation as we become estranged economically, where we have some very well-to-do people, and this sort of middle that he wrote it, unless you have a college education. We had this huge diaspora out of the South from 1940 to 1965. About 4.1 million people left to go to the Midwest and Northeast for these manufacturing jobs. And what they took was effort, hard work, and attention to duty, not a lot of scholarship. And now we're saying you just can't take hard work. You got to take things of the mind, habits of the mind about learning and scholarship. So there's been this sort of deep transformation in American culture about work and learning. I think for groups like this, how do we take all these groups out here who are excluded from the system and must get in it, because in order to do it, you need to have a high level of learning. If we provide oversight for all these processes that I talked about, and colleges and universities, what is it that we're doing to facilitate learning at the highest level and benchmark ourselves against the best, where the emerging countries around the world like India and China, is just fascinating what's going on in those countries around just the learning processes. And that speaks to Georgia, it speaks to this nation. And I think for us, right at this point in our history, we are at a kind of a watershed point in thinking about all of us who provide oversight for these business processes and practices and institutions. What is it that we do different? What is it we do better? And I think that's where this conversation is now.
Yeah, well said. Kevin?
Yeah, I think, you know, there are a lot of obstacles for adult learners, and, you know, I commend everybody in this room for working on these issues, because I think it is of critical importance. You know, we see it in our workforce, people who get, you know, stalled in their education for a lot of really good reasons and end up being, you know, held back and not realizing their full potential. And as far as, you know, some of the impediments, you know, the funding issues are certainly real, and that's important. But I think there's another thing that is important for, you know, everybody here to work on, which is closing those gaps, those perceptions that are in the minds of adult learner candidates that they can't really do this because they've been away from school for too long. And, you know, I hear that from our folks from time to time, people who we have who have, you know, high school educations, and they'll be encouraged, hey, you know, you ever think about, you know, getting some more education? And sometimes there are personal reasons holding them back, but a lot of times it's an emotional reason, if you will, that, no, you know, I'm 35 now, I'm too far away from that, I couldn't possibly get back in it. And so that on-ramp that I think you all need to create so that more folks feel like, okay, I can kind of put my toe in the water again and get comfortable and realize that I can do this is important. I don't know what that looks like. You know, you all would be a much better arbiter of, you know, what sorts of programs and what sorts of outreach programs would work effectively, but I can tell you that there is a perception among employees. It's very commonplace that, you know, it's not just about the money, it's about really their self-confidence and whether they can achieve in an academic environment. And I think the longer you are away from education, the more that self-doubt kind of ends up seeping in. And to have programs that really address that would be really important in my view.
Good challenge.
So I'm going to leave you on the hope statement, is that you all are really at the point of intersection of what we would like to call the new normal. That if our job skills are going to be changing as radically as we know they are, not in decades, but in years, there are more and more and more adults who will be returning to your classroom, or who will need to return to your classroom, or who will be encouraged to return to your classroom. And the and of feeling so overwhelmed, which I do every day, with the new rates of poverty, the new rates of the skill gaps, and how difficult it is to come out of poverty, and we know that that ramp is education. That to me, because you are at this new point, that intersection for hope for so many people, that I want to see that what you ought to know, what I see is this encouragement. The Alliance of Agency Heads, the Education Agency Head, are at a most amazing collaborative that I've ever seen, from Bobby Cagle in Early Learning to Hank Huckabee and USG. I mean, I'm just so encouraged by the collaborative. Likewise, the business leaders who are no longer mad, but they're engaged relative to how we can help everyone understand what is required to be effective in the work world. As we're even working with legislators and the nonprofits to be a part of this collective, to provide the support and the resources required to move people through to being contributing citizens. So to me, it's sort of both the burden and the blessing of the hope and expectations that we're at a point now where we can be overwhelmed by poverty and the gap, or we can use that as our opportunity to create places for people, mainly adults, to learn, to become those contributing citizens that we would wish for everyone. So that's what we commend to you. We give you gratitude and send you off with lots of hope and our expectations that you're in that place that can provide those wonderful people who can be contributing as they exit your places.
Thank you. And thank you all for letting us join you this morning. And thank you, Art, Kevin, and I really appreciate your joining me at the podium today.